For Greg, in religious populist discourse, Greg, religion becomes so politically charged that this religiosity can actually decline, and that's despite religion gathering even more attention than it's ever seen. This has been the case in many European countries, and it's becoming a bit of a theme in the rest of the world as well. Professor, is it possible to protect the integrity of religion in the presence of religious populist regimes that we're seeing around the globe?
Yeah, that's a really important question, isn't it, George? I should say, just to take a moment for the sake of my employer and colleagues, I've been at the Alfred Deakin Institute at Deakin University the last 6 years, and you know, my colleagues and I have been looking at these issues quite a lot. We're talking about two very related things, but nevertheless distinct. One is religious fundamentalism, which has elements of populism, and then political populism, which not always, but sometimes picks up on religious sentiment and identity politics as a way of quickly ramping up support. So we've seen this in Turkey, and you know, getting to the heart of your question, countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran are famous for being religious states. And indeed, what we're seeing is when you bring in a heavy top-down approach to political control of people's personal religious practice and their conviction, you tend to drive religion out of society. So there are signs that today many young Iranians feel less attracted to Islam, sadly, because of the way it's been politicized by the regime after the Islamic Revolution. And we're seeing something similar happening in Turkey, I think, that many young Turks are feeling even more polarized about religion because they see the way it's been used as a political instrument. That's not a criticism of religion, it's a criticism of politics. And of course, you know, famously, President Donald Trump, not a very religious man, was happy to take the support of the religious right in America. And there are signs that in the churches, some people are turning away from the churches because they don't like it being politicized. It may have a rebound effect too, but we're seeing people upset with religious fundamentalism, whether it's within their religious community, and you know, often it's very paternalistic and misogynist. We're also seeing people upset when politicians take hold of religion and use it as an instrument of personal advancement. The way we protect this is recognizing that religion flourishes in civil society, in that space between the state and the family. And that's where religion has to be active, in the family, of course, but also in society. But you know, as John Locke and others have famously put it, we need a separation between church and state for the sake of both the church, as it were, or the religious community, and for the state. You know, politics and religious life both become unhealthy when they get too closely enmeshed.
Greg, nostalgia is a common sentiment in religious populist discourse, and we've seen it exhibited time and again through groups that claim to be fighting to restore something that was once great and now is not so great. Why is it the religious populist groups are almost all the time backward looking? To be clearer, is there a reason for the religious populist groups' vision for the future to be a repetition of history?
Well, that's a really good question, George, because it gets at the heart of the issue. Of course, being nostalgic is fine. We all, I think, more or less like nostalgia, but being backward looking as opposed to being forward looking or progressive is a very different thing. And both in the political sphere, with political populism, you know, make America great again, harks back to an imagined past and says I can take you, Donald J. Trump can take you there. Of course, political populism says that the elite have sold you out, so I'm coming from outside the elite to help you, the ordinary person. And what I'm taking you to is the past we used to have. That's the way political populism works. Religious populism, which is an expression of religious fundamentalism, very much, whether it's Islamic or Christian or Buddhist or Hindu, has this idea: we had a golden age in the past, the age of the apostles, the first century of the Prophet and his companions, peace be upon him, and we need to get back to that. So there's no optimism about the future. There's no sense of looking forward and saying the future can be better than the past. Rather, the plan is to go back to the past. That's the whole shtick. And it's ultimately very destructive because the past that they're trying to go back to never existed. It ignores all the progress that's being made. And it is often very biased and prejudicial because it imagines that some people, and this gets to the heart of what Doug was touching on with white supremacy, that some people are replacing us, that what we used to have has been replaced because of immigrants, because of Jews, because of Muslims, because of Asians, or whatever the prejudice, the bigotry is. So nostalgia is fine. It's a good thing. But what we're talking about here is something which is actually quite toxic because it's about excluding people. And it's also delusional, unfortunately.
Let's go to Greg. Islamic populism, Greg, comes in different shapes and sizes, and it's evolved with time. I want to bring your attention to two groups from two different continents, cultures, and of course languages. The AKP that Sophia spoke about in Turkey, and the Islamic Defenders Front in Indonesia. Now, you're a specialist in Indonesia. If you were to compare the Islamic Defenders Front with the AKP government in Turkey, what would be the similarities or the differences?
Yeah, it's a really interesting comparison, George, because they are so very different, and yet they tell us a lot about populism. So, as Sophia was telling us, AK Party, the White Party, came to power in 2002. Erdogan, in his earlier political career as mayor of Istanbul, was aligned with the Milli Görüş, or the Islamist side of Turkish politics. But as Turkey urbanized through this century, over the last 2 decades, the pace of urbanization increased. Many naturally religious people from smaller towns and cities moved to the larger cities like Istanbul, and they were drawn to a leader like Erdogan, who was saying religion should be respected. Islam should have a place in Turkish society and politics. And for a long time, in fact, Erdogan and AK Party was consolidating democracy. But then in 2013, 2014, there were accusations of widespread corruption against Erdogan, and he responded defensively. And so we had the mysterious incident of July 2016. I won't call it of July 2015. I'll call it 16 coup, because I think it was anticipated and to some extent engineered by Erdogan. But he then turned on some of the same demographic that had supported him, ordinary small-town pious Muslims, including members of the Hizmet, which was a large part of that group. And he very cynically said that they were terrorists. This was in the age, of course, of Islamic State, so and after the rise of Al-Qaeda before that. So this was a bogeyman to invoke. But, as somebody who studies terrorism, this was no terrorist group. It was Erdogan trying to remove the one strong civil society network that challenged his religious authority and his moral authority. But he also fell back increasingly on his earlier days of wanting to be seen as a great religious leader. So that's political populism led by somebody who wants to be seen as a religious leader. The Islamic Defenders Front in Indonesia is a group that emerged after the fall of Suharto as a fundamentalist but traditionalist Sunni Islamic group. It got involved in street activity, vigilante activity against so-called centres of vice, often at the pay of local police commanders, so very murky past. But then shot to a level of prominence in late 2016 around street protests against the incumbent mayor of, or the governor, as the system is for the national capital, Jakarta. Ahok, as he's popularly known, Chinese Protestant Christian, and a close associate of President Joko Widodo. And this was anticipating the presidential election that was coming up in 2019. And the main rival to Joko Widodo, Prabowo, was happy to partner with groups like the Islamic Defenders Front to try and get numbers of people on the streets. I think it backfired because people were so horrified to see the way that religion was used for politics in this fashion. It was very, very counterproductive and left a strong sense of distaste. But that was an example of a group from, if you like, civil society, a religious fundamentalist group, being drawn to politics by elite political actors and wanting to be played into having a more prominent role. And I think it backfired. So populist movements in politics can come out of the world of politics or out of the world of religion. Both see common interest, and we're talking about human ambition. It's very destructive, and in the Indonesian case, I think it's so far been contained. In the Turkish case, it's led to terrible persecution of people who are some of the most pious and genuine Muslims you would come across, all in the name of Islam, which is, it's hard to think of anything more blasphemous and tragically sad and unnecessary than what we're seeing.